And this is a webinar type of functions from Zoom, which means the video functions is only myself and me right here. And the audience member can be connected to us in the Q&A chat box that's under at the bottom of the screen. And then please, if you have any questions or some technical difficulty or anything like that, please just type those in. I will be monitoring those Q&A boxes to make sure that everybody's needs are met as much as possible. And I will have Mireille speak, give us a nice slideshow and talk before. And at the end of the talk, we'll open up for the Q&A. But please don't wait to type in any questions as you go along. And I will, at the end, use my facilitations to give all the questions from you all to Mireille. So just kind of know that Q&A functions in this artist talk that you can connect to with us. And here's a little bit about Forecast. Some of you might know a little bit about Forecast. Forecast is a 42 years old nonprofit organization that activates, inspires, and advocates for public arts that advance justice, human dignity, and health. And Forecast Public Arts envisions a future where all people feel a sense of belongings, realize their potentials, and live healthy lives by embracing culture and creativity as drivers of equitable change. So that's who we are as a Forecast Public Arts working on. And we have a variety of programs at the Forecast Public Arts. Forecast Board series is curating and creating the thought-provoking contents for all of us, and we have a creative studios to engage with the tools, resources, opportunities, and funding for artists. Mural actually are one of the grantee last year's early career project grants to make her public art possible. And we have planning and engagement work through consulting and connecting with everybody who needs a lot of help, or even just sometimes listening ears. And also we changes public art policies through the programming and in our planning and engagement work. And we always engage through learning, and our learning institute is for public artists, creatives, and professional to learn about what is happening currently in the public art world. And last but not least, we work with community to address inequity in all facets of public arts through Change Lab. So please tune into some of the different Forecast Public Art programming. And tonight, we are broadcasting this artist talk from the Dakota land, and we would like to acknowledge those who were here before us and here now and will be here in the future. If you'd like to learn more about how we can make this land that belongs to the Indigenous people, please visit illuminative.org for more information. And lastly, in this day and age, I cannot just forget to acknowledge what is happening currently in the society and then serious economic crisis and health crisis everybody's facing, and this artist community, as well as all the community that's facing this pandemics. And Forecast Public Art is trying to do our ongoing works to bump up more resources for the artists and on our website. So if you have any questions, please check us out on the websites. Currently, we have pro bono consulting work. So if you have any questions or helps or how to make it out of this pandemic, please give us an email and check out our websites to see where it can take you. And we also published a toolkit during this pandemic for artists and organizers to keep working on our public arts endeavor. So check out that toolkit as well. And Candidas and Hawana, who are other artist consultants at the Forecast, have worked beautiful toolkits for all of us to be able to share. So I hope you will check those out. And now I get to introduce our awesome artist tonight, Moira Villiard. Here's a little bio about Moira. It's a long one because, you know, she's super impressive. And then I'm going to read her bio. So forgive me for me leading a little bit. So Moira Villiard is a dynamic visual artist, Though early in her career, she displays a high degree of proficiency in a variety of artistic genres, including portraiture, illustration, graphics, and digital designs, and a muralist. She's also a community organizer, curator, and passionate art educator, concentrating her efforts around issue of equity and justice, including arts access, creative placemaking, environmental sustainability, youth empowerment, and acknowledgements of Indigenous land, culture, and history. Moira grew up in the westland of the whole Duluth reservations, and then until recently worked as an arts and culture programming coordinator for the American Indian Community Housing Organizations. Currently, she is focusing on creating her artwork full-time and working as a freelance consultant, designer, speaker, and grant writer. She was broadly recognized in 2019 when she received the 2019 Duluth NAACP Take a Stance for the Revolution Award, Emerging City Champion Fellowship, Forecast Public Art Early Career Project Grants, YMCA Women of Distinction Award, and the Duluth News Tribune 20 and 30 Award. Her work has been featured in numerous shows in the Duluth and around Minnesota, including her recent solo show, Rights of the Child, as group show Beyond Borders at Mac Rosti Arts Center, and We the People at the Minnesota Museum of American Art. She received her bachelor degrees in communicating arts, global studies minor from the University of Wisconsin-Superior in 2016. Without further ado, I would love to invite Moira and have your artist talk start. So I am going to unshare my screen, and then you please go ahead to turn on whatever you want to. And welcome, Moira. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Thanks to everybody who is here to attend. I guess if you have any questions, as she said, you can put those in the question box. I love to have more engaging talks rather than, talking everybody's ears off. So if there's something that I say that you want to know more about, feel free to reach out in the little chat box down below. But yeah, I guess I'm here to talk a little bit about my experience with the Forecast Public Art Grant. I'll give you a little bit of my background, and just some things that I've learned through that experience. Yeah, and if I sound a little bit congested or sniffly, I'm having a really bad allergic reaction today. I was gonna paint my office for this artist talk and going over the top, and I ended up being allergic to the paint. So thankfully Zoom has a filter that clears up the redness. So yeah, I'm gonna share my screen really quick. Share. Okay, that is, oh, there's so many things on this screen right now. So I got a grant from Forecast Public Art last year. Here it is. And I'll just kind of play this in the background as I talk. It won't have audio. But Making It Up North from, in conjunction with PBS, did a short documentary that you can find online. And my project was essentially to do these creative crosswalks with the goal of incorporating Indigenous land acknowledgement alongside, the stories of the neighborhoods that each of the crosswalks was in. And so I'd partnered with an organization called Zeitgeist Community Arts organization based in Duluth, Minnesota. And this was actually one of my first grants that I had received. 2019, as you saw in my biography, was a pretty big year. And so, yeah, Zeitgeist had reached out. We'd done one project in the past together that was a giant fish mural, which I'll pull up a little bit later, that took place sort of in the sort of nearby the lake walk in Duluth. And they came back and had asked if I wanted to facilitate more community painting sessions, only this time do it with a lot of community engagement. And so for this process, we ended up doing a series of sessions where we did door knocking. So this involved going to people who lived around the areas where we were gonna paint and telling them that we have this this project that's going to take place, and we want to know what makes your neighborhood special. What do you love about living there? What are challenges that the neighborhood faces, and things like that. And so I'll go off of the screen share from that point because that's the rest of my stuff. Yeah, and so we ended up going door to door and having just these really engaging conversations with residents living around the crosswalks. And part of my goal with the project, as I said, was doing something that involved Indigenous land acknowledgement. Because living in Duluth, we have, you know, a lot. We're a fairly artsy city, I would say, but the art is definitely lacking in any sort of diversity and in stories of folks who aren't necessarily part of the mainstream of our region. And so in the door knocking sessions, I was trying to just brainstorm a way to essentially, you know, merge Indigenous concepts with stuff that the residents currently identify with their neighborhoods. So for example, one of the murals was a 7 Generations mural. We'll go back to screen sharing really quick and show you that one and kind of talk about it. Let's see here. Essentially, we've gone door to door, and one of the first people that I talked to was a woman who had talked to me about the significance of different, I guess, different generations living together in the neighborhood. And there's been a lot of issues with, you know, drug abuse, and you know, the opioid epidemic here in Duluth is pretty intense. And so she said that a lot of grandparents were taking care of grandkids. And there's a concept, here it is, there's a concept in Indigenous, in the Anishinaabe teachings, where we always look ahead with our actions, 7 generations ahead. That's not the image. Yeah, it's over here on the side. We always look ahead 7 generations, and any of the actions that you take now essentially will be impacting those future generations. And I felt like as soon as she told me about, you know, the significance of people, you know, multi-generational homes in this specific neighborhood, I was inspired to figure out a way to make an overlap with those two concepts and ideas. And so in this mural, yeah, it ended up being 7 rows of people who kind of form puzzle pieces. And one of the things that, I hope this is still working. Let me know if I'm cutting out. Technical difficulties. I think I'm still here. One of the, oh, hold on. Am I still here? Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but your images is kind of stopped.
Yeah, okay. Well, hopefully that unfreezes soon. Yeah, so 7 generations. She also talked about, you know, I wanted to know more about, I guess, community spaces where folks gathered most in that region. And she'd mentioned a bus stop. So the mural concept ended up being 7 generations of community members. And when you think about it, in a healthy community, 7 generations exist from great-grandparent down to great-grandchild. I wonder why my screen is so frozen. And each of those generations was standing at that bus stop. Let's see. This is so obnoxious. Why are there technical difficulties? Okay, I'm gonna close my screen for a second. And Shift Q.
Miri, do you want me to stop your screen share 1 second and then get back to you? people who's listening right now, do you mind typing in a Q&A box and saying if you can hear Mireille or not, or if the screen is frozen or not? Sorry that I cannot really hear you or see your face. So thank you for typing. Okay, so people can actually hear. Oh, the screen, for some folks, screen is spinning. Okay. Mireille. Oh, the screen is black. Okay. We were a little bit afraid of the internet technicality as we were practicing too. So. Okay, so people are not hearing the sound from Mireille. She is offline, and I'm sure she's coming back up. Sorry for the little wait and technical difficulty. Maybe I can get Mireille on the phone here. Just a moment.
Okay.
Oh, I was just about to call you and put on the speakerphone.
Yeah, I have no idea what happened. I think my computer just got overwhelmed.
Is it helpful if I screen share and then like navigates a little bit of your images from the sidewalk, or?
I think it should be okay
Okay.
now. Probably just had too many tabs open. Hopefully people are still here. Oh, cool.
People are here.
Thanks guys for sticking around. Yeah, so I went over and kind of talked about that specific mural. We ended up doing 4 different murals across Duluth in different neighborhoods, and repeated that process of going door to door, you know, getting introduced to the folks that live there and finding out what makes their neighborhood special. And overall, there's also this attitude in Duluth occasionally of, I guess, a scarcity mentality uh, that comes about when people think about public art. And so the experience that I got to have with Forecast and doing this in working on this grant really was revelatory for me towards some, I guess, miseducation around public art. For instance, around the time that I was doing these murals last summer, there was somebody who had spray painted boulders in their own neighborhood. They had spray painted them rainbow colors, and the city went in and power washed and removed all of those painted, or the paint on the boulders. And it was interesting reading some of the news comments that came about while I was working on this project, because that story came out just before, you know, the news started really heavily covering the crosswalk murals. And people were making comments like, oh, so you can paint on a street, but you can't paint a rock in your backyard, and things like that. Not understanding that those two things, like that, first off, the crosswalks themselves, as a public art project, had another goal of making the process of getting public art approved in our city a little less complicated. Because right now there's not there's, I guess, a form that you can fill out through the Public Arts Commission, but there's lots of different people that you have to get approval from in order to do public art. And you certainly can't do public art without permission in our region. And so I found it interesting that, you know, folks seemed to think that I just went out there and started painting streets when it wasn't the case. You know, this was grant funded. It wasn't tax dollars necessarily going to pay for this project. And it had a mission, you know, based on research that Zeitgeist had been doing around safety of public spaces and making our city more walkable. The areas that I had painted, let's see if I can screen share again. Oh, it's such a dangerous exploration here. So let's see, Villiard, Mural. You'll see in one of the images the rabbit painting that I did. Oh goodness, there was a giant. There it is. There was a giant pothole behind this rabbit image, and the symbolism of the rabbit was really just, I wanted to, these murals were by a school. I wanted to do something quirky and fun, and there were tons of preschoolers painting with me on this, so the design had to be really simple. So we created together we created this giant rabbit bus, kind of like if you're familiar with Hayao Miyazaki's cat bus, it was a little bit like that. But yeah, behind it, you know, the news was covering these stories a lot. And there was just this giant pothole. The road was in terrible condition. And it was sort of interesting to see that after all the publicity happened around, you know, us painting on these really bad streets, that the city actually went in and refilled the potholes in those areas. But yeah, there was, in other instances, there was a series of butterflies that I had painted with kids and with people in the neighborhood, that was on a path where it was like 3 sections of road that come together, and there's no stop sign, no crosswalk. It was a blind intersection basically, and there were lots of families that lived in the area too. And so we created butterflies that went up the roadway, because it's on a hill, so that drivers, when they're, you know, turning that corner and inevitably speeding down this hill and into a neighborhood, that they would slow down and recognize, I guess, that, you know, with creative crosswalks, it's all in the hopes to recognize that there's people living in the space, and that there's, it just ultimately, it has a goal of making people be more cautious in those areas. And so, yeah, safety was kind of Zeitgeist's agenda. For me, it was figuring out ways to merge Indigenous concepts with contemporary histories, getting back to that scarcity mentality mindset where folks feel if one ethnic group that is not part of the dominant narrative gets their stories shown or heard, there's just an attitude that we run into where it's just like there's no room for those stories. And if we talk about, you know, Native history, then somehow that is in opposition to the history of people who immigrated to, you know, Duluth or really wherever you are. There's a definite attitude in dominant culture folks that, you know, if we give resources, if we give time, that people are gonna, I don't know, that there's just not going to be enough time or space for their stories. And I was trying to really demonstrate that, look, like, we can talk about Indigenous history and we can talk about the history of how your ancestors got here. And those things don't have to conflict. They happen at the same time. And so, yeah, that was really the goal of that grant. And I think from the forecast grant, I got just lots of media coverage. So we ended up not really spending much of our budget, which was nice for advertising, because the news came out and filmed basically all of the sessions. And as you saw, Making It Up North did a short session on the whole project. As you saw, there's lots of kids involved. I really like to involve kids in public art because I feel like, you know, it's ultimately for them. It's, you know, it's for the neighborhood that they're growing up in. There was for the butterfly one, there was a family that I'd worked with over at, when I worked at ACO at the American Indian Center. There was a family that had just moved, and they were some of my favorite kids ever to work with. I used to do art with them, and they just moved to this neighborhood, and they saw that I was painting this mural right by where they were, where they just moved. So they came out and saw, hung out with me, and then through that experience of doing this public art together with the rest of the neighborhood, they got to meet other neighborhood kids and eventually create those bonds that built up community, I guess. And that was, I guess, another, benefit that happened through this project was for folks who were just moving to the area, and they got to know their neighbors through these events. And I wouldn't say that doing, crosswalk murals is something that is, I wouldn't say that it is super feasible in Minnesota because of our roads and the conditions of our roads and potholes and things like that. And ultimately you have to create this work knowing that it's either going to require a lot of upkeep, or that, in the wintertime, it's just going to fade because you have so many snow plows and stuff going over it. But there's something, I think there's a lot of value in that experience of, doing it with a purpose of converging different parts of history of a community, and the hidden stories that nobody talks about, and getting people out to create art with each other. I think in a lot of the spaces that I've been in, and a lot of workshops I've hosted, people always tell me like they haven't picked up a paintbrush since they were a kid, and very infrequently did they even get that opportunity as a kid. So I think, there's a lot of value of just getting people together on a sunny day and making the road look nice, and so, yeah, let's see. I think I lost my train of thought. But yeah, that was my first, it was really just sort of a dream idea, I guess. And I was actually very surprised when Forecast had funded it, because I didn't necessarily have a background in public art. It was obviously an emerging artist grant. And I was super grateful for that opportunity, because building off of that, yeah, I can share my screen now, I guess. Building off of that, I got other opportunities. So as you'll see over in this vicinity here, without this crashing, this is another mural project that I got to work on at UMD. Again, using that concept of trying to incorporate Indigenous ideas or stories into the landscape of a place, essentially. So they did a land acknowledgement. They released a land acknowledgement statement and wanted to commemorate it with these, interactive experiences for the students. So yeah, the cool part of that too is, I guess I believe firmly right now that the creative placemaking movement is great. It's where we're, bringing art into public space and beautifying spaces and getting community acknowledgement, because, the, some folks who work in that field of, let's see, yeah, some folks who work in the field of creative placemaking have this tendency to want to create a new history for a space, and often, it doesn't. People don't realize that we're in the United States, where everywhere you go, there's an Indigenous history somewhere, and there's still people alive that have that knowledge and those stories, engaging with Indigenous communities and Indigenous artists to get those stories shared and to show those overlaps in history. Another
Hey, Miri, I think your sounds is breaking up a little bit here. I hope Miri come back really quickly here. Oh. Miri went offline. I am going to give her a call. Apology for the technical difficulty, y'all. We'll work it out. Hey, Miri, I think we dropped you. So it's kind of like people listening to you through my phone. And could you all maybe type it in the Q&A if you can hear Miri while Miri is like trying to navigate through that technical stuff? So Miri, say something.
I am saying something currently and hoping everyone can hear me. And hopefully folks can respond if they can hear me. I'm gonna try and pull this up on a different device.
Okay, oh yeah, a lot of people can hear you. And it's a little bit, yeah, people can hear you. So while you, I don't know if you can navigate, Mira just told me that Mira is going to go back on the iPad instead of computer and see if that works or not. But you were just talking about how does the kind of the Indigenous work and how you are using the spaces and talking about those, and those are really great conversations to have. So if you want to continue on the topic and while you're getting back, or I can also navigate the screen share and find the images that you want to find too. So
yeah, hang on, let me just see if I can get this thingy to work. Do you know what the meeting ID? Oh wait, no, I think I found it. Is
you got it? Okay.
And if it's not right, then I will ask. 6173. Okay, that looks like it was right. I am logging in right now on my other device.
When technology works good, it works, and it doesn't, you know? It's just a new type.
Well, if folks have questions too, if there's stuff that they want to hear more about, I'd love to.
Yeah, there's actually one questions about, and you were touching on that a little bit, but it's asking a questions about relationship is like cities and states and different regulations. So this is a question regarding the street painting project. How easy or difficult was it to work around the city, states, federal regulations about painting the street? Or which one was your approach to be able to move around all those codes that regulated crosswalk?
Yeah, good question. So obviously every city is different. One thing that I learned through this process is every road is different. So some roads I think are owned by the state, and those are pretty much off limits for any sort of painting. But then there's roads that I think are owned by the city, and that was sort of the different sort of roads that we were targeting. And yeah, as far as the relationship with the city, my advice for future folks who are interested in doing sort of creative crosswalks and things of that nature is to really get a good ally. In my case, it was Zeitgeist, so I didn't have much experience except for in just making art and doing design and that interactive side of things. And Zeitgeist is really good at being an advocate. And yeah, being an advocate, they had staff who were, had the time and the energy to go in and really fill out a lot of the paperwork that was required at a city level. And so, yeah, having an ally, having an organization, if you don't know somebody who's really connected with the city, find that person, because it seems like as I move forward in trying to sort of independently do projects with the projects that require city approval, it's really difficult to do on your own. So, yeah, does that kind of answer that question? Still trying to get in on this call.
You were talking a little bit about you were not public art artists before the forecast grants, and that connected you to a different project that you were sharing, one of the mural that you have done. But I would love to hear a little bit more in terms of like, how does the making a project in the public spaces changed you in the practice you have now, and then what's the other project that's coming up? Oh, Miri's back.
Okay, and I'm gonna try and I'm gonna dial in on my phone so at least the audio doesn't cut out.
Got it.
So let's see, pick a number to dial. Sure, that one. Okay. All right, I'm gonna let you go and I'm gonna call in.
Yes, sounds good. And I'm gonna stop my screen share so everybody can see you, Miri. And meanwhile, Miri kind of getting back into her own feet. If you have any questions that you want to ask to Miri, just please type it into the Q&A.
I'm here, I think.
All
Can you
right.
hear me?
Yeah, we hear you. We hear you. Hooray.
Goodness, what an era. Oh, gosh. Okay, so yeah, I heard you saying if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop those in, and I can kind of steer the direction of this conversation. Otherwise, I can just keep talking about public art and yeah, that whole experience. So yeah, again, have allies in connecting with the city. It is really hard in some spaces to make that network and to connect. And yeah, I think another important thing is, there really needs to be more education around public art, and I think the only way to get that education is to do more of it. So it's kind of like this weird cycle of trying to educate people by example, while also for public artists, putting up with a little bit of community pushback that is misguided, I guess. Yeah.
I'm curious, Miri, you were kind of talking about the forecast grants kind of got you to the kind of a next place of like what you're talking about. You got one experience in the public arts and then like you're unstoppable now, right? So do you want to talk a little bit about the project you're working on right now? What's in your kitchen right now? When we were practicing a little bit, we were talking about this COVID-19 hits with not be able to do community engagements in the public spaces is super hard, and love to hear a little bit more about how you're navigating those right now. And your camera is spinning. Very interesting.
Yeah. Like my iPad's at like a much lower level, so I have to like hunch. Yeah, so forecast was a huge boost for me. I look at life as a series of intentional accidents where I've just kind of applied for things even though I didn't know 100% if I qualified or if, everything is really a shot in the dark for me. So, the first of those intentional accidents was going to college because I come from a family that is really opposed to the college education. And then, the second of those sort of jumps for me was I had applied for the public relations intern position at the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council. And I interviewed and they didn't select me for that, but they chose me to be the student liaison on their board. And it was there that I kind of learned basically at 18 years old, the value of grant writing and what even grants, what they are. And I served on that board for about 5 or 6 years. And for the majority of my time as an artist, I was too young to qualify for a lot of grants. A lot of them have requirements that you have, 8 years of experience or what have you, which I had been developing through the work that I was doing. But, you run into weird sort of hurdles like that when you're applying for grants. And so last year I was finally old enough and finally, had enough backing and enough of a body of work to actually start submitting grants. And obviously forecast was one of those. And I think it was one of the most beneficial grants from the standpoint that there was so much media attention that came with it, just because public art on this scale and with this level of involvement wasn't happening in Duluth at the time. And it was different, and, through that process, I also had to learn how to say stuff really quick. Because a lot of the time they'll take the most the news stations especially will take the most watered down thing that you have to say. So I would talk about all this stuff about Indigenous land acknowledgement, and then they would take the part where I said, community engagement is important and things like that. So with that grant, lots of media coverage. It ended up leading to all of these other projects and really kind of launching my career in public art in a strange sort of way, and figuring out ways to again do that overlap of Indigenous ideas and public art together. And now I feel like it's a tricky time for everybody right now with what's happening with the pandemic. And I'm very curious just personally about all these conversations that we've been having about space for underrepresented voices and communities, and all of these conversations and activism that we've been doing around, getting people together. My vision, once I left my job at the American Indian Center in January of this year, and I was so ready after the forecast grants and after, the emerging city leaders grants, all of those grant opportunities to just ride this wave of momentum through 2020 and just being in crowds of people, painting with crowds of people, like hanging out with kids and, just making art and making space. And obviously March rolled around and everything got canceled. So right now I'm currently just, navigating in my mind what that conversation around space is going to look like, and how we keep that momentum going. And by space, I mean, at least coming from a context of Duluth, for those of you who aren't from Duluth, it's not urban and it's not rural. It's just a mix of those two things, and it comes with all of the benefits and the cons of living in either a rural or an urban area. I think Duluth often gets lumped into greater Minnesota, and we're not much like greater Minnesota. So, but a conversation we've been trying to have, at least for, you know, the range of diverse people of color and Indigenous folks out here doing activism and art, is how do we get physical space? Because things happen, and you know, we have the American Indian Center where I was working at, but it seemed like everything was tied to that one center, and even that center had a lot of difficulty opening up in our region, a lot of pushback from the community, and still to this day, as they, you know, get more buildings to create more community space, there's always pushback that, you know, Native people, everybody just assumes we're just going to build casinos in places, and we're, you know, yeah, there's just a lot of stereotyping that happens in that way. And so my activism and my work has been around trying to get space and physical space, because if you don't have physical space, then you don't really have a presence that can be, you know, passed down in the community. Or when, you know, people of color and Indigenous folks, when leaders die in small towns, or when they leave, there's no places for folks to regroup. And so hopefully that's not too far off on a tangent, but now that we have this actual, you know, a society and expectations in place where we need to stay home and not occupy physical space together or in large numbers, I'm really, really curious to see what that means for artists who are doing all of this work to be seen and to exist, which hopefully Forecast can do an artist talk all around that concept, because I think that would be really interesting to hear what people are doing across Minnesota to have that conversation.
Noted.
Yeah.
I think love to have that conversations too. Thank you for that thought. And I'm really big fan of your work, and I love that your boldness of just apply, right? Like let's just do it. Let's see where it takes you, right? And maybe it's very personal level, but I have been thinking quite a bit about what kind of a programming, like I myself kind of getting into the public arts, not by accidents, but like a little bit surprising way. And from that opportunity, like I couldn't believe how much more opportunity I have gotten. And I have been very often frustrated about, it always asks you need to have an experience to do something, right? And what kind of program would you be interested as an emerging artist? With your career, it's almost like you're emerging, but what does it feel like? What are you hearing in other artists and yourself? What kind of program you want to have it out there for more people to be able to make art?
I think it's interesting because, you know, I mentioned serving on the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council as long as I did. That experience was really life-changing for me from the standpoint that it gave me a lot of the behind the scenes of the grant process. And with that experience, you know, it's just like with the Forecast grant, where I had the one thing on my resume that I got really, you know, committed to and served for 5 years. And I work for on contract with ARAC now. But with that experience, I got to serve on other panels and other boards and kind of get to hear sort of the conversations that get had behind the scenes, and change those conversations to some extent. Because typically, you know, I'm usually the only young person in the room, and by young I mean, you know, well, I'm 25 now, but for the most part, you know, I was under 25. I was usually the only Indigenous voice in the room. Oh, cats. And yeah, I wished I feel like in a lot of the conversations that were had, everybody has their bias. You know, panels are typically volunteers. And at the end of the day, panels are humans. So that's one thing that I really took away from that experience of, you know, sitting on panels, was realizing that there's room for human error sometimes. Sometimes you just get a bad panel and it doesn't mean that you're a bad artist. And I try, when I sit on panels, to really bring up the conversation about, like, well, what, you know, we're supposed to stick to criteria, but who does our criteria exclude? And a lot of the time that's young folks. And I know it goes to the opposite side of the spectrum. People who are over 40 often, you know, experience issues with, you know, ageism and things like that. But I'd love to see more grants for young folks. I would love to see more Duluth representation on panels and just in, you know, in the grant world, because, you know, when you sit on panels, a lot of people don't understand that context of Duluth, because if you're from the cities, which a lot of folks who sit on panels for arts grants are, they don't have that context. And so sometimes it looks a little bit crazy when you've got, like, all of this stuff on your resume and, you know, it doesn't seem feasible that you could take on another project, when that's just the reality of small towns a lot of the time. Is artists are, you know, they're involved in a lot of things, and they work for one arts organization while volunteering their time somewhere else and running I don't know, some other program that's their own personal project. So I'd love to see more understanding of that, you know, geographic representation. And yeah, I really wish I guess another thing, I know the forecast grant I got was an emerging artist grant, but I think it's kind of, the word emerging is kind of funny to me, because it can be interpreted as so many different ways. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'd just love to see young people, Indigenous people, more geographic representation, all of that happening in the grant world. Yeah, I feel like I rambled there, but.
Oh, that's really great. A lot of things you're talking about is a lot of things that's in my mind as well. And yeah, the word emerging is very interesting. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like, you know, you can be emerging later in life, but if you look at my resume and all the awards that I've gotten, you know, just last year I got, I think, like 5 emerging artist awards. So does that make me, like, after doing those 5 huge projects, does that make me still an emerging artist because I got only this title? And it also kind of alludes to this question of, could a young person get a non-emerging artist grant? And that's not to say that, you know, young people are always the ones doing more work, but I think of young artists of color who have challenges that maybe an older white artist does not have to face, and they might be disqualified. Even if they're making this huge impact in their community, they might be disqualified on the basis of just being, you know, too young to apply for a regular artist grant. So I'm always questioning, you know, I don't know, what age is the cutoff for when you're emerging?
And at the forecast public arts, we talk about emerging artists for public art. So you might be really seasoned artist for painting or other medium. However, you've never done the public art project. They actually qualified as emerging artists for public arts. And, you know, like, I think it's all the idea of labeling and people thinking about how can I fit in that bill is kind of an interesting question of its own. And yeah, I thank you for bringing up. And here's a question from one of the listener here, participants. I'm sorry, not just, it feels like a listener because I don't get to see you. But the question is, hey, Moira, Mira, it's really great to hear more about my name. I'm sorry. More about your work. Can you talk a little bit about your digital design practice and how, if it intersects with your public arts and paintings? I'm thinking specifically of the design for that Bring Her Home show last year.
Yeah, there's definitely a significant degree of overlap right now in my digital art practice and my public art practice. My first grant through the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council, once I was eligible to apply, was for an iPad, and so a lot of the I also suffer from a lot of chronic pain stuff, which makes it so as a visual artist I can't physically paint that often. And one of the magical things about public art and digital art are that they, I guess, they require a little bit less exertion from the standpoint with the public art, where, you know, people are literally becoming the paintbrush. I just do the outlines of the work and everybody else fills it in, and then we get to see kind of what we create together. And I love to have people improvise on that. But yeah, with the iPad, which I'm using right now for Zoom, I'm able to draw, you know, directly onto photos of walls and do my sketch work like that. I guess that's the main intersection of where those two art forms fit together. Yeah, I think, does that answer your question? I hope so. That's the main thing I can think of. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I want to ask one question, and I hope that answered your question. But what's cooking right now? What are you working on? Public art, painting, design? Like, you are now chosen yourself to become a freelance artist, and how has that changed your life? What have you been doing?
Yeah, still figuring out again how to do large scale murals, painting with multiple people, but not having multiple people to paint with right now. I have a mural that's in the west side of Duluth that I'm going to be working on. That'll be my first actual like outdoor mural on a wall. I kind of, I guess the series of artworks that I've worked on and all the different types of projects that I've gotten to work on have been really all over the place, and where I'm starting and the level of knowledge that I have for any of it, it's just kind of diving in and making mistakes along the way. But that's the cool thing about art, is it's a really safe place, I feel, to at least technically make mistakes. I also am working on a Chief Buffalo mural memorial on the lake walk of Duluth, which again, when we talk about the intersections of my digital work and my more realistic, I guess, painting work, digital design work often has a lot more lines, or at least my style of digital design has a lot more lines, and so it's been interesting to see my style sort of shift as I do all of my, you know, freelance digital work, developing more simple symbolic stuff, and converge it with my traditional painting background, where I'm doing more realistic portraiture. In my recent show, I don't think I can do it. I was gonna pull up, maybe I'll send this to you, and you can pull it up on the screen. But at All My Relations Gallery, I have a show on the rights of a child, and that was the paintings in there. You can see that influence of digital design, where there's lots of lines and solid colors converging with my more portrait and surreal style. So yeah, I've got that show. We're trying to figure out how to have that in an online space. And I'm going to send, let's see, I will send this link to be shared on the screen.
Yeah, whatever you send it to me, I can share that.
What All My Relations did was they put my exhibit, because obviously I had this first solo show in the cities at All My Relations. Super grateful for that opportunity. I got to do my first, you know, solo body of regular work through a state arts board grant. And then COVID happens, and the show is only allowed to be up for about a month and for public viewing. And All My Relations ended up using a program to do a sort of virtual reality of the show, which is really interesting. So that is something that I'm trying to explore a little bit further, because that show is going to be traveling around, and obviously in the next couple months, it's not going to, I don't think it's going to attract big crowds of people due to all the stuff that's going on. And on the other project I'm working on is, again, those murals down by the lake walk commemorating Chief Buffalo, and again trying to get this idea that, you know, we can talk about Indigenous history in the city without overshadowing or taking away from the mainstream history of, you know, Leif Erikson and the mainstream stories that get told about Duluth and the post 1900 stories. And so, yeah, Chief Buffalo, for those who don't know, he's kind of the reason that a lot of the reservations exist today, but he's also the reason that folks got to immigrate to our region, because he signed the Treaty of 1854. And it's sort of interesting to look at a history like that, where it was sort of like, you know, this mediation when Native folks were really being handed the short end of the stick on a lot of things and being mistreated in the time frame that he was around. And through his advocacy, it made sure that treaty rights could stay. But there's just that other note of, you know, it also gave people permission to immigrate to Duluth. And why doesn't Duluth as a whole, whether you're Native or non-Native, why isn't that a celebrated story of how the community came to be? And it's for the most part because people don't want, you know, they don't want to celebrate Indigenous history because it's a slippery slope, I guess, with that scarcity mentality.
Okay, I have your art steps the sites here, so I'm gonna share screen. Yeah, thank you for naming about the fear that we carry is about Indigenous history. Like, I think that's absolutely great. But I'm gonna share the screens, and please continue to talk what you want to talk.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So here is, sorry, I'm not 100% sure how to navigate it all, but do you want to talk?
you can just walk around. This is a cool form that exists right now, and I guess the tool is artsteps.com. I haven't personally used it, but Alexandra at the All My Relations Gallery put this together. And yeah, this is a show that I did that tried to explore this notion of doublethink. I think a lot of my artwork is really just revolved around how people think and how people contradict themselves. And so, you know, just as people feel like history can't be shared, this show was really exploring how people view the rights of children, essentially. And the posters themselves kind of go over like legal definitions so that people have a framework to talk about things, because when you go, I guess, conversations these days always revolve around, on both sides, always revolve around how we treat other people. And whether you're conservative or liberal, folks use human rights as a justification for their beliefs. But a lot of the time we hold, you know, contradictory viewpoints. And for instance, the show was kind of inspired by a conversation with a cousin that I had who's very pro-Trump, very, you know, pro-life, all of these things. And he commented on one of my paintings as I put it up, and he said, you know, how can someone who is pro-choice do a show about the rights of children when you believe, you know, babies should be killed? And, you know, I thought about it and I was like, well, I don't understand how you can, you know, preach about human rights and the rights of children and you believe that it's okay under some circumstances to put kids in cages. And it was just kind of an interesting moment with that conversation, because it made me realize, like, I could understand where he could see my view as contradictory, but, you know, I think he also realized that his view was contradictory. And so there was kind of like this weird moment of understanding that I wanted to explore through this exhibit of, if we're going to talk about human rights, we should really use these legal frameworks. And if we don't like them, you know, we need to also have those conversations so that we have something that we can all, you know, a perspective that we can all talk from. Yeah, so really just merging. I like to merge stuff in my work.
Mira, this
Yeah,
is
and this
kind of a virtual exhibition that's going to happen because the gallery space are not currently open, or?
Yep, I think they're working on getting this posted publicly pretty soon. And I think it works with virtual reality helmets. I'm not sure. I think I read that somewhere on the website, so you could actually, you know, be in the exhibit space. And it's really cool because it, you know, it's based exactly on the layout of all my relations and how it was displayed. So it's almost, you know, almost like being there.
Yeah, and what you're talking about in terms of merging many issues in one place, I think that's a very important things for all of us to be talking about, not just like isolates or make it in like single points about Indigenous rights or human rights or children rights. Like in so many things are in tangents to it all, you know, like the history is not separated from any of the rights or immigrant rights. And, you know, I love that your way of talking about how to merge everything, not everything under the umbrella, but not be afraid of putting things together, because I think that's the contemporary world is all about, right? And I think that how you're working as an Indigenous artist in this very contemporary format is what we need to be talking more about. Like, you know, you were kind of saying that, love to hear more about forum or whatever out there, that what is the artists who are Indigenous folks is doing, because I think the contemporary artwork is not being spoken enough, and I love to see where that can take Mira. Yeah, that was my personal opinion. Sorry, that wasn't the question.
Yeah, no worries. I think, yeah, overlapping ideas that I think a lot of my work is just trying to show that sometimes things aren't as polarized or as opposite as we like to, you know, naturally believe that they are. And that, you know, life has nuance, and I really hope that any of the spaces that I'm creating or any of the work that I'm creating allows people to think and not be afraid of those nuances. Because especially, you know, looking at, I mean, another thing I'm curious about with all of everything being moved to Zoom and to these virtual meetings, is just, you know, social media bubbles, right? We already lived in a society where people isolated themselves to specific news sources, specific, you know, social groups. Everything was sort of selective. You still had to go out into the real world and, you know, experience things that you may not agree with or what have you. But, you know, for a lot of people, their social media is just their bubble where they can exist and see things that they want to see. And now that we're moving to this more like at home, reliant on social media even more, I'm really curious to see what happens with those social media bubbles. And again, those conversations around diversity and the importance of representation. It might only be people who care about those issues who are going to tune into those webinars. You know, it might only be people who care about public art who will, you know, go to a public arts webinar. And we're so really saturated in content that, you know, we can just pick and choose from. But it's a slippery slope, I feel. You know, and I'm hoping, you know, it doesn't lead to more isolation and more polarization, because people are more able to choose what they want to hear.
Agree. Agree. Okay. Well, it's like, a few minutes ahead of 7:30, but if you have last thoughts or comments, questions to Mireille, I'd love to see that in the Q&A. And then it has been really wonderful to be talking with you, Mireille. Thank you so much for working through the technical difficulties and all that. And yeah, it's really this year I think a lot about accessibility through internet and bandwidth, and you're saying that Duluth was not having a lot of good internet luckily now, and that really can be cause a lot of difficulty in the day and age. But thank you, and I just wanted to quickly put last thoughts out there. The forecast is hosting every Saturday at 6 p.m. Black, Indigenous people, people of color, artists, kind of what's that, Zoom meetings in a way. It's kind of a private conversation that we can have, BIPOC artists. So Mira, it's not exclusively to Indigenous artists, but it might be something for you and other folks who are interested to kind of tune in and see what conversation that's happening in there. It has been actually really beautiful place, people connecting and kind of having the chance of randomness, right? Like kind of walking into the gallery space and meeting somebody you have never met, and like a cat that coming into the screen.
Yeah.
So, like, please don't forget that opportunity is there. It's limited, right? It's limited to the kind of the concentrated way, but hopefully I can see you there at one point. And I absolutely forgot my video was not shared. I'm sorry. I'm here. And as I babble, there's one question. It's just the comments, and thank you for the fun session. No worries on the tech difficulty. Great work. Looking forward to seeing Miri's new work as well. And I love to see your new work in person. And I love that there's a virtual gallery getting set up, so we have access to it. But I hope that we get to all come see your work in person. So
yeah, I hope so too. And I went to the first I think it was the first of those forecast talks with Candida and the other folks, and bought one of the other artist books because she gave a little plug on it. But yeah, so those are great spaces, and yeah, I hope I'm excited to see some of the conversations that have happened moving forward.
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mireille, and then thank you so much for the folks who are here tuning in. And webinar is just so awkward that I don't get to see you or hear your voice, but kind of getting your vibes being here together. So once again, thank you so much, and I'm gonna finish this virtual artist talk. Thank you so much. If you have a last word, Mireille, I will send it to you, and then we'll end the meeting.
Yeah, I'm not a good person to go to for last words. But I totally hope that folks got something out of this. And if anyone feels like reaching out, I don't know, Google me and you can find my email and ask me questions or collaborate, or if you need help with grants, I do that. Yeah, but thanks everybody for coming in this little chat with all of our technical difficulties.
And then like a lot of people making comments saying thank you, and it's no problem with the technology, so we did it. Yes.
Yay.
All right, well, sending a lot of loves to you, to the Duluth and all the folks that you're connected to, and same to you all people who were able to tune in tonight. Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.